Hey everyone, this week I would like to share a word with you from the life and teaching of Jesus. Honestly, it's a teaching that goes back to the basic call of discipleship, the ordinary call of discipleship, which is a radical call indeed. This call of Jesus shattered expectations in his day. People expected things about Jesus. They expected him to be someone and to do things that he never came to be or do. And if we're not careful, we can fit into the same camp and do the same thing. Expect things from him or expect him to be somebody that he never intended to be for us, right? And so I might shatter some of your expectations today. That would be a good thing, possibly. And so ultimately what I want to do is just look at what Jesus said and let the chips fall. He shattered expectations of what he would be like and what the good life is all about. He did not come to fulfill our hopes and expectations and to make it possible for us to live the American dream. That's not what he came for. Rather, he came to call us to radical allegiance to himself, to orient our whole selves to the kingdom of God, to live a life of sacrifice, and ultimately to follow him. And so the context of this, of Jesus breaking the expectations of his disciples and his invitation to follow him, is in the context of Jesus had been previously preaching about the kingdom of God. He had been previously preaching and teaching about the kingdom and then authenticating it by the works that he did. He made deaf people hear, blind people see. He fed thousands of people with a few loaves of bread. Really cool stuff, right? It's evidence that demands a verdict. Who is this guy, right? But it's more than just that. All of that stuff is in fulfillment of passages from the Old Testament, like Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 61. Evidence that demands a verdict. And Jesus turned to his disciples at a point on the road and says to them, "Who do people say that I am?" And Peter pipes up as an advocate and says, well, some people say John the Baptist or Elijah. And Jesus says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter, nails it. You're the Messiah. And Jesus owns that title, even though there were some cultural expectations of what that meant. And he would frustrate them. He goes on to say then, shortly after that, he says, the Son of Man, owning the title Messiah, also identifying himself as the Son of Man, Daniel 7, big deal. He says to them that the Son of Man is going to suffer. He's going to be rejected, and he's going to die. That's not what they expected. That's not what the people of Israel expected. They expected a conquering king riding on a war horse. They wanted a guy to ride in a Chevy 2500 Duramax diesel, kick butt, take names. They wanted that kind of guy. They didn't want a humble servant king who would give his life and suffer and die. They were looking for a conquering king to rescue them from political oppression, not to rescue them from the power and penalty of sin. And that's exactly what Jesus came to do. And that was exactly what the Old Testament foretold Isaiah 53, right? And so all of that's the background. And if we're not careful, we can do the exact same thing. We can expect Jesus to fit into a box that he does not belong, that he did not make, and that we, in fact, made. And we want him to fit in, but he doesn't fit. And so if we're not careful, we can expect Jesus to fit into our paradigm. We can see him and what he came to do through the wrong lens. And if we do that, we will be frustrated because Jesus did not come to help us realize the American dream of life, liberty, and happiness. He did not come to give us health, wealth, and prosperity. He came to invite us to life with him and to a life of allegiance to Jesus. Ultimately, he invited us to the way of the cross, and that's the way of Jesus. And that's what we're going to see here. The way of Jesus is to come and die. The way of Jesus is an invitation to life with risk. It's not an invitation to play it safe. It's an invitation to live for riches in heaven and not ultimately live for riches on earth or comfort, right? And so the way of the world is actually the way of self-preservation. It's the way of health, wealth, and prosperity. That's not the way of Jesus. The way of the world is to live a life that is all about safety, avoiding risks, getting healthy, playing it safe, doing whatever it is that makes you happy, or just do you, is a cultural thing. It's not the Jesus way. Jesus' radical call discipleship is for all who will listen. When Jesus was talking with his disciples and he explains this call to discipleship, he invites the whole crowd. And so this is for everyone who's willing to listen, and it's an invitation to come and join Jesus. It's not merely an invitation to check a box out of options that says, yes, I'm a Christian. It's an invitation to radical reliance. It's an invitation to radical allegiance to Jesus. Let's look at this ordinary call of Jesus to discipleship, which is very radical indeed. And it's out of Mark. I'm going to be in Mark chapter 8, verse 34. And Jesus is speaking and calling the crowd to him with his disciples. He said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? What can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." And so there we have Jesus' invitation to discipleship. And he talks about what it means to follow him. And it's a bit radical, right? And this is ordinary discipleship, but it's radical. He gives 3 commands, and there are 3 actions he invites us to take up. And this is what it means to follow him. The 3 verbs are deny, take up, and follow. And we see that in verses 34 to 37. That we're to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. So first one, deny ourselves. That means we need to renounce the claim that we have on ourselves. We need to give up our self-autonomy, which we are notorious for in America. We need to give up our self-autonomy, relinquish that to the lordship of Jesus, right? It means that we need to relinquish sometimes desires, some of them good, and bring them under the lordship of Jesus and say, God, is this what you have for me? But that means we ultimately need to kill bad desires. All of us struggle with temptation, bad desires, desires of the flesh, and those are the things that we need to kill. We need to relinquish them and bring them along with our personal goals under the lordship of Jesus and say, Jesus, this is what I want. Is this what you want for me? Right? And this is not Josh House on a tangent. This is very consistent with what the New Testament says. 1 Corinthians 6:20 says that we were bought with a price. And so therefore, as a result, we're to honor God with our bodies, right? And so we were bought with a price. The very blood and life of Jesus is our purchase price. Galatians 2:20, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And then 5:24, that those who belong to God have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. So if we belong to God, there's stuff in us that needs to go. There's stuff in us that needs to die if it's sinful desires and passions, things that are inconsistent with the kingdom life of God, inconsistent with the life of Jesus. They need to go, right? Pastor talked about it this last Sunday, Romans 12:1, that we are to offer our whole bodies as a living sacrifice to Jesus. We're to offer our whole selves to God, right? Not just our money, but ourselves. That's the hardest thing to give, is ourselves. Second, we're to take up our cross, right? He says to take up your cross. That is shocking language, but we are so accustomed to crosses that we have lost sight of the shocking value, the shocking words of saying take up your cross, right? We take up our cross and put them around our neck as a piece of jewelry, but for them, that was a ridiculous notion to hang a cross around your neck, because in our culture, it's sanitized. In their culture, it was horrific, because the cross was the most horrific capital punishment tool ever invented by a wicked imagination. It was horrific. The only comparison we have is take up your electric chair and follow me, right? We don't have electric chairs around our chain because that would be blasphemous virtually. I mean, it's horrible, right? That's what Jesus is saying. If you're going to follow me, you need to be willing to suffer, experience difficulty, even ridicule for following Jesus, right? Ultimately, it means that if we're going to follow Jesus, we need to take up our cross and risk being treated shamefully, right? It doesn't mean that we're going to ultimately always get our way, but actually we need to be willing to suffer if necessary for the sake of following Jesus. Now, before we get all caught up in this missionary or martyr mentality, the reality is what we need to be concerned about is not whether we're willing to die for Jesus and go to the cross for him, but rather what we need to be most concerned about is that we're being faithful in the small stuff, right? We're to be faithful in the small stuff, and if the time comes, we'll be faithful in the big things. And so the best thing that we can do is be faithful in the small stuff. Are we being faithful in the small stuff? Because if we are, we'll be just fine when it requires bigger things, right? And so that's the best thing we can do is focus on being faithful in the small stuff. Because he who is faithful with little will be faithful with much. And so ultimately that call to Jesus is to be willing to take risks and to suffer if necessary for Jesus' sake, right? Third, he says that it's to follow him or to follow me. Take up your cross and follow me, right? This is a call to action. Discipleship is a call to action, not to passivity. And so it's not ultimately about self-preservation, but it's rather actually about being faithful. The invitation of Jesus to follow him is an invitation to faithfulness. To follow him, that's the mark of a disciple, is that we are in process of striving to become more like Jesus, that we're following him, people of action, not passivity. Ultimately, it's about process, being in process, and not about perfection. We're not perfect. We have not arrived. But it is about being in process. And so then Jesus goes on to say in verses 35 through 37, I'll read it real quick. He says, "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? What can a man give in return for his soul?" And so the point here Jesus is making here is that the way of Jesus means we won't live for self-preservation. That's not what it's all about. The way of Jesus is not about self-preservation. It's, in fact, to take up the cross and follow Jesus means that we're going to live to give, not to preserve. We're going to live our lives to give ourselves away, not to preserve ourselves so we can hunker down and hide. The way of Jesus is not the way of hiding. The way of Jesus is taking risks for his sake, for the sake of the kingdom, and for the sake of those he loves, right? It means that we'll be willing to get sick in order to love a neighbor, right? If somebody is in need, that we're willing to take risks and even possibly get sick, even in a COVID culture, right? Now, it means we should be responsible so we don't get somebody else sick. That's not very loving. But it does mean that we're willing to take risks, even if it means we get sick. Yes, even die for the sake of loving another person. I think that's more fitting with the way of Jesus, right? It means that we're willing to risk ridicule for the sake of Jesus, for the sake of following him and being faithful. That we're willing to risk awkwardness, right? It's a little bit awkward to talk about Jesus at times, to talk about life with God, and to talk about the fact that we went to church. That's a little bit awkward sometimes, but following Jesus means we're willing to take risks, even if it means losing my job, right? For example, if you work with children or in a hospital or wherever it is that you work, and somebody is in need of hope and help, and they are asking deep, big questions about life, we need to be willing to talk about Jesus in that situation. If a kid is asking you about Jesus and it means you might lose your job, I mean, what do you do in that situation? In my opinion, the best thing that we can do is talk about Jesus in a safe and responsible way. But even if it means losing our jobs, we should strive for faithfulness. Because I'll tell you right now, I'm okay with losing my job for faithfulness, not for being a jerk, but for being faithful. If it means that we take risks to talk about Jesus and we lose our jobs for it, that's a risk well taken, right? And so I think ultimately the call to Jesus means that we're willing to take the cost, count the cost, and take the risks, right? We don't need to live looking for martyrdom. We don't need to live being a jerk and calling that martyrdom either. All we need to do is simply live and strive to be faithful, and if the time comes, we're going to know what to do when the situation comes. It means we're going to talk about Jesus when the time comes because it's just going to make sense. And if there's a cost involved for talking about Jesus, let it be, right? Then he goes on to say, if we're in verses 38, if we're unwilling to do so, that he'll be ashamed of us. If we're unwilling to do so because we're ashamed of him, he's ultimately going to be ashamed of us when he comes. That's what he says in verse 38. I'm going to read it real quick here. What does he say? He says, "For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." And so are you afraid or ashamed to talk about Jesus? Are you afraid to talk about Jesus because there might be risk involved? Are you ashamed of Jesus and don't want to talk about him because you fear awkwardness? Well, I fear that sometimes we can be so concerned with fitting in that we actually put way too much on the line when, in fact, somebody's eternal destination is in the balance. Really, at the end of the day, the cost involved for being faithful is quite small when we consider the grand scheme of eternity. And so, if we're truly ashamed of him, it says that he'll be ashamed of us. And I don't want to be that. I don't want to be ashamed of Jesus, but I will be honest with you. There have been times when I have faced the opportunity to be faithful and I was afraid and I did not step up as I wanted to, right? If we're honest, all of us are at times afraid and we cave into fear. Well, let's strive to be faithful. Right? Thankfully, Jesus' acceptance of us is not based on our performance. But at the same time, ultimately, if we're truly his kids, we're not going to ultimately be ashamed of him. That's not going to be the pattern of our life. So I want to ask you 2 questions to think about. And the first one is this: in what ways have you been ashamed of Jesus? In what ways have you been ashamed of Jesus? And I'll give you an example from my own life. Recently, actually, it was quite humbling. I was getting ready to talk about this text at my young adults group, and that week I was picking up my car from Bell Tire. And I was going to get dropped off and wait for my car, and I had nothing to read with me, so I decided I'd just grab my Bible. Well, instead of just grabbing my Bible, I started to put it in my computer bag. I had no computer in it, I had nothing else, and I was going to put my Bible in my computer bag just so I could bring my Bible to Bell Tire and read. And I realized what I was doing, and I asked myself the question, why are you putting your Bible in a briefcase bag? Dude, you just need to carry the Bible. And I realized what I feared was being a little bit awkward. I didn't want to walk into Bell Tire carrying my Bible, to be honest with you. And so I realized that I was fearful, that I was afraid, and I was actually ashamed. And so I pulled my Bible out of the briefcase bag, and I said, I'm just going to go to Bell Tire, and I'm going to sit, and I'm going to read, and I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And that was an opportunity for me to choose faithfulness to Jesus rather than fear and hiding. Second, my question for you is, what in your life is keeping you from following Jesus as you want to? I assume of you that you want to follow Jesus. But there's always things in our life that can tend to hamper that, put a damper on that, and keep us from following Jesus the way that we want to. So what is it? And so I invite you to ask yourself those questions and say, what in my life is keeping me from following Jesus the way I want to? And I invite you ultimately to join me as we do life with Jesus and follow him. And it's a radical call to follow him, but in seasons like this, when everything is taken away, we realize that's all we have, is our relationship with God. And so that's ultimately all that we have in the end, is our relationship with God, and how we respond to this question will affect what it looks like for us as we wait to gather as a church family as we have in the past. And so thank you for listening this week. Have a good week.